Imagine for a moment that you're wandering through a museum and looking at cabinets in the ancient Egypt section. You start observing sculptures dating from the Old Kingdom, the golden age of pyramid building. As you scan over the faces of these mighty pharaohs, you note their expressions: a serene gaze, a confident smirk, a goofy grin. But as you wander onward into the Middle Kingdom, a mere 130 years later, you see this. Instead of serenity, you see worry. Instead of a smirk, a grimace. Instead of a grin, a frown. The question I want to ask is, why? Why did pharaohs go from showing themselves as youthful and tranquil to world-weary and grave? Do these Middle Kingdom statues show the pharaoh as a careworn shepherd of his people? Or do they suggest something altogether darker? Answering this question will take us on a journey through extremes: chaos and order, optimism and cynicism, control and collapse. And we might just learn something about the nature of power itself. Let's get stuck in. Egyptologists and other nerds argue about when exactly ancient Egypt was at its greatest. But the Old Kingdom, the period of the Giza pyramids and the Sphinx, is pretty hard to beat. Sure, the Middle Kingdom had better literature, the New Kingdom had more military might, but the Old Kingdom had the pyramids. But what if the Giza pyramids tell us more about life in the Old Kingdom than we initially might think? To build such epic structures, you need few distractions and tens of thousands of labourers. This requires peace. Workers will struggle to heave these massive stones if they have to dodge arrows and rocks, or if there is widespread military conscription. There's also some evidence that the workers who built the pyramids were actually having a rather good time. Graffiti left on stone blocks in the pyramids reveals some charming names of the work gangs there, like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkaure. Excavations at the worker camps at Giza show they were also fed large quantities of meat and beer. But Egypt's geography also helped isolate the growing kingdom from foreign enemies. To both the east and the west, the Nile Valley is surrounded by extremely harsh and inhospitable desert. Whilst nomadic Libyan and Asiatic raiders did feature in this period, they were more like a fly to an elephant, nothing more than an irritant to the pioneering builders of the Old Kingdom. But how is this state of affairs reflected in the statues of the pharaohs? Let us take a masterpiece of Old Kingdom sculpture, this nice statue of the pharaoh Khafre Enthroned, as our example. And by nice, I mean nice. It's a stone. Khafre was one of the Old Kingdom's heavy hitters. He is the guy who built the Sphinx, as well as the second largest pyramid. This statue originally stood in a valley temple serving Khafre's pyramid, where priests would pray for the pharaoh's soul for all eternity. The pharaoh is depicted as lithe and youthful. His expression is serene, confident, with the hint of a smile on his lips. He seems strong and self-satisfied. But it's more than this. This is a king enjoying the full grace of the gods. Look closely and you'll see the god Horus embracing the back of Khafre's head like a cuddly pigeon. So with their unprecedented building works and their stable peace, the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom must have felt invincible. It must have felt like the gods themselves had descended to Egypt, brightening the heavens with a shining nimbus of protection. But everything was about to change. The collapse of Egypt's Old Kingdom is comparable to many of the great catastrophes in world history. The iron grip of the pharaohs in Memphis was suddenly shattered as war and famine stalked like jackals over the withering fields of Egypt. Once hallowed pyramids like that of Snefru at Meidum became a camping spot for nomadic herdsmen who littered the place with broken pottery and animal dung. So, what happened? One prime contributor is the climate. A worldwide phenomenon called the 4.2 kiloyear event led to less rainfall in the rugged Ethiopian highlands where the Blue Nile starts its journey. This caused a series of low Nile floods in Egypt, leading to crop failures. But these failures also happened in a political context where the state was fragmented and less able to respond to such crises. The pharaoh Pepi II had lived so long, perhaps well into his 90s, that he had outlived all of his successors. This prompted a succession crisis when the old pharaoh finally popped his clogs. When political crisis meets crop failure, the result is utter anarchy. Regional governors called nomarchs found themselves with far more independence as they tried to rally local resources and help the starving people who began crowding around the villages and riverbanks. The inscription of one of these nomarchs, a man called Ankh Tifi, portrays scenes of chaos, violence, and starvation. I found the house of Ku inundated like a marsh, abandoned by him who belonged to it, in the grip of a rebel, under the control of a wretch. All of Upper Egypt died because of hunger, every man eating his own children. The towering pharaohs of yesteryear were succeeded by marginal figures so obscure that they barely show up in the archaeological record. Even those with jobs in the royal bureaucracy, like a man called Indi from Abydos, speaks on a stone stele of his prowess in battle, but barely mentions the pharaoh he served, a massive departure from the conventions of the Old Kingdom. The material culture is also quite radically different. No longer do we see the stunning craftsmanship of a Khafre Enthroned, but more crudely made images and statues, some of which look little better than Play-Doh monstrosities from a kindergarten art class. But perhaps the most terrifying and vivid descriptions of the First Intermediate period, which this 130-year period of decentralized power is called, can be found in the retrospective texts of the Middle Kingdom. Forsooth, the river is blood, and yet men drink of it. Men shrink from human beings and thirst after water. Great and small say, I wish I were dead. Little children say, I should not have been born. Eventually, in around 2050 BC, an upstart nobleman, Mentuhotep II, conquered the whole of Egypt, reuniting the two lands and binding them from his new capital at Thebes to form Egypt's Middle Kingdom. But the statues of early Middle Kingdom pharaohs show no radical innovations, with royals trying to mimic the style of the Old Kingdom to reassure their subjects that stability had returned. However, yet more disruption was crawling over the horizon. In Egypt's eastern desert lies an inscription dating from the reign of Mentuhotep II's grandson, Mentuhotep IV. It describes his vizier or prime minister, a man called Amenemhat, leading a quarrying expedition. There, Amenemhat was confronted by two miracles: the birth of a gazelle atop the stone destined for Mentuhotep IV's sarcophagus, and the onset of a rainstorm in the desert which revealed an overflowing well. It seems the gods had touched this Amenemhat. Funny then, that soon afterwards a man of this name would appear as pharaoh, founding Egypt's 12th dynasty. Evidence is slender, but he may well have deposed his predecessor in a coup. Even so, still stability seemed to remain out of reach, for Amenemhat himself was subsequently murdered in a palace uprising. It is clear that the divided politics of the First Intermediate period refused to dissolve overnight. Even as the pharaohs reasserted themselves, they were hounded by poison plots, regional rivalries, and cloak and dagger politics. It would take a commanding figure and a radical agenda to turn things around. Enter King Senusret III. A prodigious builder and patron of the arts, he furnished Egypt with several new pyramids. But his sculptures, like Middle Kingdom literature, were about as grim as a frozen swamp. Now, one could view his statues in a charitable light. Are we looking here at a world-weary king? The face of a man whose youth and vigour had been spent rebuilding a country traumatised by natural disaster and civil strife. Look at his huge fan-like ears. Do these not show a man prepared to listen to his people, to feel their pain in his bones, and endeavour to help them? Or perhaps his ears are attuned to the will of the gods, registering their cosmic commands with all the accuracy of a satellite dish. Instead of the idealised forms of the Old Kingdom, I find there to be something really refreshing about the gritty, careworn, pessimistic depictions of Senusret III and his progeny. But, and it hurts me to say this, there is a major twist in this tale, and it is not a happy one. There is a very different way to see these statues, and this interpretation is, I think, on balance, more plausible. This, the argument goes, is the face of a tyrant. To explain properly, we must retrace our steps. I described the Old Kingdom as a time of grinning kings, of prosperity and peace. But what if it was an unjust peace? Arguably the most long-lived symbol of the pharaoh, surviving from prehistoric times to the day of the Roman emperors, is that of the king grabbing captives by the hair and smashing their skulls with a mace. This doesn't exactly imply a cuddly form of monarchy. But in the Old Kingdom, I think the most shocking expression of pharaonic power can be found in the notorious cannibal hymn. This is part of the pyramid texts which are found inside the pyramid of the pharaoh Unas. It describes the pharaoh killing and eating the gods. For Unas eats people, lives on the gods. For Unas eats their magic, swallows their spirits. Their great ones are for his morning meal, their middle ones are for his dinner, their little ones for his night meal. Their old males and females are for his fuel. It is the great ones of the northern sky who lay a fire for him, for the contents of the cauldrons, the legs of their elders. For those who are in heaven serve Unas. They scrape out the pots for him with their women's legs. Now, we mustn't forget that this is a magical text aimed at transfiguring the pharaoh's spirit and isn't necessarily a political statement. But the shocking language still gives me, at least, the impression of a violent megalomaniac. Is it possible, then, that instead of cocktails by the Nile, the Old Kingdom was more like a Bronze Age North Korea? And, if it was, how might we re-evaluate the First Intermediate Period? I don't doubt that there were genuine disasters during the First Intermediate Period and waves of chaos. But while chaos is the great villain of ancient Egyptian theology, in practice, it can bring opportunity. Inscriptions at Dendera in the tomb of a royal chancellor and steward called Senusret III emphasized that he was a brother of the common people, despite his royal connections. Ankh-Tifi, the nomarch who recorded parents eating their children, also proudly claims, "I gave bread to the hungry and clothes to the naked. I anointed the unanointed. I shod the one who had no shoes. I gave a wife to the one who had no wife." Sounds like a good deal, although it should be pointed out that this formula did in fact first appear during the late Old Kingdom. Still, the later Middle Kingdom literature, embodying the aristocratic and royal perspective, laments the fact that the poor and lowly had become successful almost as much or even more than it laments the violence, destruction, and death. The possessor of wealth now passes the night thirsting. He who begged for himself his dregs is now the possessor of bowls full to overflowing. Poor men have become owners of good things. He who could make for himself no sandals is now the possessor of riches. Horrifying stuff, I know. Social mobility was seen by Egypt's kings and nobles as an immoral inversion of natural order. But, as is so often the way of things, obscure magnates who benefited from the demise of the Old Kingdom would in turn become harsh pharaohs. None more so than the kings of the 12th dynasty. Senusret III broke the power of the nomarchs. Their local dynastic tombs disappear in his reign, with the nobility instead cramming and fighting to have tombs as close to their sovereign as possible. But Egypt's borderlands weren't spared either. Sinai was ravaged by this grim-faced pharaoh, and Nubia, which had been slowly recovering its independence, was gutted, yoked under a huge series of fortifications. Senusret sealed the perimeters of his empire with might and magic, seeking to dominate all who may rebel, who may plot, who may fight, who may think of fighting, or who may think of rebelling on this entire earth. So now, we return to the statues. This gaunt expression is not the face of concern, but of callousness. The pharaoh can hear his subjects with his big ears, oh yes, but he isn't listening to their prayers, he is listening for whispers of sedition, of treason. And when he finds them, those thin and bitter lips will mutter murderous commands. Senusret's style of sculpture would go on, aped by his descendants who aspired to the cold and bloody heights of his rule. His legend would persist. 1,500 years later, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus would hear tall tales of a king called Sesostris, who had conquered the world as far as the coast of the Black Sea. But the most visceral indicator of his legacy is the fact that all 40 surviving statues of Senusret III appear to have been intentionally vandalized. A tiny act of revenge against the man who had subdued a people. Ma'at and isfet, order and chaos, these two things define human history as much as they defined ancient Egyptian thought. Today we have looked at a period of chaos bookended by periods of order, but orderly tyranny. The Old Kingdom was a time of pharaonic confidence, imprinted on their smirking statues. But with such a concentration of power, the common people lived, at best, as comfortable chattel. The First Intermediate Period, on the other hand, created opportunities for economic and social mobility, but it also resulted in a fragmented and fractious land of warlords, scarred by bloodshed and starvation. Then Senusret III cruelly reforged the power of the Old Kingdom. But that power led to order, and for the people hiding behind the king's coattails, peace. I wonder if such a peace, supervised by a paranoid tyrant, was worth it. But at least during the reign of Senusret III and his descendants, the pharaohs gave up the faux friendliness of their predecessors. The smiles of the Old Kingdom were masks, projecting an invincible benevolence which was largely a lie. But Senusret III, he didn't hide his burdens or his cruelty, he made statues out of them. And in doing so, he told a truer story about power. His statues are so mesmerizing because they show absolute power at its most honest, as joyless and pitiless as stone.